The first industrial revolution had forever changed England and later the world. After 1871, however, Europe was experiencing tremendous material growth produced by the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution gave rise to new inventions and products, new markets and larger factories, and a new leader in the competitive industry. In Unit 5, we studied the First Industrial Revolution. Initial advances in industrial development were made in the textile industry. Coal and steam were the primary energy sources, and the railroads revolutionized transportation. In the Second Industrial Revolution, steel becomes the primary building material. Two new energy sources are introduced: the internal combustion engine and electricity. An industry will harness the power of science as chemicals become an integral part of many production processes. The period from 1875 to 1900 is sometimes referred to as the Technological Revolution because it saw the greatest concentration of technological advances in human history. There are a number of characteristics that distinguish the Second Industrial Revolution from the First Industrial Revolution. During the Second Industrial Revolution, Germany emerges as the dominant industrial power, surpassing Britain in steel, iron, coal, and chemical production by 1900. The development of applied science saw the use of chemistry to produce fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and the materials needed to produce photographs. The assembly line and interchangeable parts led to the mass production of goods. Especially popular were consumer items, as consumer culture was emerging. New energy sources transformed industry with the discovery of the internal combustion engine and electricity. Technological innovation also impacted communication with the development of the telegraph, the telephone, and the radio. Finally, these new industries created a need for professionals who had specialized knowledge and skills, like engineers, architects, chemists, and accountants. During the 19th century, Europe's population doubled from roughly 200 million at the beginning of the century to more than 400 million by the end of the century. Advances in medicine, public health, and the understanding of human anatomy and disease prevention took place in the 19th century and were partly responsible for rapidly accelerating population growth in the Western world. However, this pattern of population growth is actually explained by a decreasing death rate, since by the late 19th century, Europeans were adopting the modern trend of smaller families. Cities continued to grow as many people chose to live in the urban areas of Europe. Numerous cities worldwide surpassed populations of 1 million or more during the 19th century. In fact, London was transformed into the world's largest city as its population expanded from 1 million in 1800 to 6.7 million a century later. Edwin Chadwick was the architect of the public health movement, which had as its goal improving living conditions in the cities. His book, The Sanitary Conditions of the Laboring Population of Great Britain, demonstrated the need for public health reform. In his book, Chadwick concluded that one's life expectancy was directly related to social conditions. He also demonstrated that the average lifespan of members of the working class was 1/3 that of professionals and other members of the middle class. Chadwick also introduces the sanitary idea, which was the belief that most diseases could be prevented by cleaning up the urban environment. The bacterial revolution began in the 1870s as scientists discovered that submicroscopic organisms were the main cause for disease. The first breakthrough was Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease, which states that microorganisms are the cause of disease. Then, Robert Koch was able to isolate specific types of bacteria as the causes of specific diseases. He is credited with discovering the bacteria that causes anthrax and the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. Finally, Joseph Lister introduced the antiseptic theory as he discovered that an antimicrobial substance applied to the skin could reduce the possibility of infection. Together, these discoveries led to a substantial lowering of death rates, especially in the cities. One of the most profound effects of the Industrial Revolution was the growth of cities. Throughout Europe, only 17% of the population lived in a city in 1801. By 1851, the percentage increased to 35%, and by 1891, it was 54%. Cities grew so rapidly, the services could not keep pace, so cities were places where a lack of sanitation, accumulation of sewage, high rates of disease and crime, and poverty all existed. Thanks to the public health movement, city governments began to install sewage lines to remedy the sanitation problems and work to improve the quality of the water supply. After the 1850s, urban planning became common. One of its forms was the improvement of public housing. Another was the provision for parks within and around cities in order to provide for relief from the crowded urban environment. Public transportation in the form of the electric trolley or streetcar was made possible by the development of electric generation plants in the cities. The continuing process of industrialization and urbanization brought further changes to the social structure and continued social stratification. The middle class becomes diversified and will find itself divided into three divisions: the upper middle class, the middle class, and the lower middle class. Within the upper middle class, you find your bankers, industrial leaders, and entrepreneurs who are engaged in large-scale commerce. Your middle class was comprised of businessmen, professionals like doctors and lawyers, and merchants. And the lower middle class was comprised of independent shopkeepers and small traders. The working class now comprised about 80% of the population. Within the working class, you found highly skilled workers who were at the top of the working class and were about 15% of the population. Then you had your semi-skilled workers, those who engaged in trades like carpentry, bricklaying, or successful factory workers. And at the bottom of the working class were your unskilled workers and domestic servants. The Second Industrial Revolution occurred in the last quarter of the 19th century. The First Industrial Revolution saw steam-powered machines replace human labor in industry. The Second Industrial Revolution saw electricity replace steam as the main power source in industry. Although general health care and standards of living were improved, many social problems of the First Industrial Revolution were not solved. Unemployment remained a problem, and the gap between the rich and the poor continued to grow. Britain led the world through the First Industrial Revolution, and while they continued to play a major role in the Second Industrial Revolution, by the beginning of the 20th century, Britain's position as world economic leader was lost to Germany and the United States.